Hi, I'm in Carmen, Manitoba. I'm here with Anne Kirk, cereal crop specialist with Manitoba Agriculture. And looks like we finally have a spring day here. It's April 21st, the sun is out. We had some much different weather last week, and it made me start to think a little bit about seeding dates for cereal crops and seeding rates. Just as a little bit of a refresher, what can farmers be expecting?
Sure. So for seeding dates, typically earlier is always better. So we have a lot of data from MASC where we can see things like seeding dates and actual yields averaged over quite a few years. And for spring cereal crops, yield is typically always better when it's seeded the last week of April versus going into May. So earlier seeding is typically better. If we wait until later in May, due to environmental conditions or any other reasons, we could expect maybe 85% of our average yield when seeding the last week of May versus something like 110% when seeding the last week of April. So there can be quite a difference depending on when we get that seed in the ground.
Okay. And now when it comes to the different types of cereal crops, of course, you got your oats, your spring wheat, and your rye. What type of rates do they differ from crop to crop, actually?
Yeah, so they are quite similar, but they do differ a little bit. So we're always talking about recommended target plant stand versus seeding rate because we want to make sure that farmers are seeding based on their target plant stand, their germination and mortality, and then also the seed size. So we know that seed size and germination can differ quite a bit, so just making sure that we use those in our seeding rate calculations. But for spring wheat, our target is typically 23 to 28 plants per square foot. For oats, it's a bit lower, so about 18 to 23 plants per square foot, and barley's right in the middle at about 22 to 25 plants per square foot. And we'd be adjusting our typical, our target plant stand, depending on a few factors, like what we're expecting for weeds. Obviously, we want to go a bit higher if we are expecting, if we want more competition against weeds. If we are in a situation where we have a lower expected yield, say we are seeding later on in the season, we'd want to be bumping that seeding rate up a bit as well. So if our yield potential is higher, we can actually be going on the lower end of those seeding rates.
What are some of the early threats to some of the cereal crops out there? Now, we were talking a little bit earlier, frost isn't so much of a threat to them because they're kind of fairly resistant to that sort of thing. They're tolerant to that. What other things might growers want to be conscious of?
Yeah, so early season diseases can be an issue. So I'm not sure on the exact numbers, but a fair number of people are using seed treatments on their spring cereals. And whether or not you choose a seed treatment depends on a few factors, like the past history of that field. Have you had issues in the past? How tight your rotation is? And then how cool and moist that soil is at seeding time. So if the seed's going to be sitting in the ground longer in cool conditions before it comes up, then we might want to think more about seed treatments as well. And in terms of frost, that growing point for cereal crops is below ground for quite some time, and the time when it would typically be more susceptible to frost. So we don't worry too much about frost, especially with a lighter frost.
There was a story I read in one of our publications called Grain News not too long ago. It had to do with ultra early seeded wheat. And I wanted to ask you about this because I'd never really heard of that before. It was happening in Alberta, so I was just kind of curious, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's super interesting. So the reasoning behind the ultra early seeded wheat, they're typically seeding when they hit a target soil temperature at the depth where the seed would be placed. So say at about 1.5 inches. So once that temperature, the soil temperature reaches 2 degrees, they're going in and seeding. In Manitoba, we're probably usually seeding anywhere from say 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, but depending on how cool the season is. In Alberta, they're doing it for a few reasons. One is to try to get that crop growing and be in the more risky growth stages in terms of heat early on in the season. So say if we think about anthesis, typically the wheat's flowering at kind of the hottest time of the year. If we can bump that back a bit and have the wheat flowering, say 2 weeks earlier, potentially it would be better for the crop. So the research that's been done, it really depends on the location. So seeding dates could differ anywhere from early January to say mid-March, depending on the location. And they're seeing that they're not typically seeing a yield penalty. So yields tend to be better or about the same as seeding, at the typical timing. In Manitoba, there has been interest as well. We're in a bit of a different situation because in January, February, and March, we hopefully have snow cover on the fields, and we also wouldn't be able to traffic those fields. So the ground is typically frozen or quite wet at those times. So farmers in Manitoba are generally seeding as early as they can, as early as they can get in the field. So I don't see a lot of potential for seeding that really early, like that January, February, like they're doing in Alberta, but it is something to consider. And Manitoba Crop Alliance has done some on-farm trials in 2024 and 2025 looking at ultra early seeding. So those farmers were seeding at 2 degrees or as early as they could get in the field, and then seeding at that 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. In those on-farm trials, they didn't see any yield differences between those treatments, and the timing difference in some cases was a week between those two seeding dates. In some cases, it was about 5 days. So, so I would really recommend people seed as early as possible those spring cereals, but I don't know how much potential there is to seed earlier than we already are.
Okay. So you mentioned the word winter when you were talking about ultra early seeded wheat. You'll be talking about winter wheat tomorrow for your crop talk webinar. Today's April 21st. How does the winter wheat crop look in Manitoba?
Yeah, it's early to look at the field and see how the winter wheat crop is doing. It can be kind of deceiving at this time of year because sometimes you look at the field and plants look fairly green, but they haven't actually started growing again, or plants look quite brown and they also haven't started growing and they're totally fine. So early on in the season, the best way to assess a winter wheat crop is to actually dig it up and see if you see any new roots coming. If it's too early to see if new roots are coming, you can dig it up, wash those roots off, put them like in a plastic bag with some air to see if we do see some new growth coming. So, waiting a week and seeing if we do see new growth. And we're really just looking to see if that crown is alive. So there's actually a website called wheatworkers.ca, where out of the University of Saskatchewan, where they're mapping soil temperatures and winter wheat hardiness to identify if there's any winter kill days throughout the year. So they're really looking to see, based on knowing how the crown of the winter wheat hardens off, if there's any days where the soil temperature dips and the crown wouldn't be hardened off and we would expect some winter kill. Based on the data from this year, we haven't identified any winter kill days, but that would really depend on the amount of snow cover, the stubble that people had in their fields, and kind of their individual conditions. But I am expecting to have a fairly good start to the winter cereal crop this year.
All right, thanks for your time. Great seeing you again. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.